Ever been curious about the background of your favorite Naraka hero? Perhaps you haven't been able to finish their cultivation, or want to learn about a hero you don't plan to play. Welcome to the Naraka Legends lore series, where we tell the heroic tales of each character verbatim from the in-game chapters. Join us on today's quest as we delve into the history of
Golden Keeper Shayol Wei.
Ever since she was young, Shayol Wei's sleep has been plagued by the same nightmare. In her dreams, she was deep in a maze filled with a deep white fog that obscured her vision. Yet with bejeweled aurum blade in her hand and the certainty of law in her heart, she has solved every mystery she confronted, slicing through the fog of mystery and getting ever closer to the truth. It was getting late, and the atmosphere at the Liu family mansion was lively as people feasted and drank the night away. As a wealthy and illustrious family, well known in the area, no expense was spared in the holding of this banquet. Master Liu, the patriarch, was seated next to the head of the table, a position occupied by a snowy-haired sorcerer with unique charisma. All of a sudden, a few knocks on the door echoed, and the guests who had been all smiles and chuckling became completely silent. Looks of terror were etched onto their faces, with Master Liu looking particularly ashen, as if he had just seen a ghost. He grabbed the arm of the sorcerer next to him tightly, his unease apparent. "No puny spirit would dare cause trouble while I'm here." The sorcerer nodded towards Master Liu and assured him, "Fret not, Master Liu. You merely have guests." Master Liu gave a command, and a servant proceeded to open the door while trembling in fear. The guests who had arrived were, of course, no spirits, but government officials. The servant was obviously relieved at this revelation, but was immediately wary again after seeing the warrant and stony expressions on their new guests' faces. He hastily retreated to make way for them. The female at the front led a group of men through the guest hall, with a straight-faced expression so frosty it seemed anything she laid eyes on would freeze. She had on the distinct black and white embroidered robes worn by officials, and possessed a cool, domineering aura. This was matched by the finely adorned sword she had on her back, adding to her already commanding presence. The lady made her way to the crowd and surveyed them before laying her gaze on the man seated at the head of the table. She parted her lips, every word coming out of her mouth sounding like an order. "We are the Golden Keepers, and are here to detain a suspect in a poisoning case." 4 hours earlier in Wanyang County. It was a night just like any other, yet Master Liu found himself burdened with worries for his family. He tossed and turned, unable to fall asleep. Thump! Amid the silent darkness, a clear, dull knock could be heard coming from the wooden door to the courtyard. Someone was pounding away on that door. Thump! Thump! Bang! 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 All of a sudden, the noise increased in intensity. This wasn't just a knock on the door. Someone was bashing away at it. Master Liu got up in a hurry and awoke the able-bodied workers in his household. However, by the time everybody was armed with pitchforks and flung the door open zealously, there was nobody to be found. All they could see were a few startled crows and an empty alleyway, illuminated by the eerie light of the moon. At the headquarters of Wanyang County's administrative office, a man in embroidered robes ended his vivid and detailed report of the events that had transpired at the Liu estate. He tilted his head upwards and gulped down the tea in his cup before stating, "Everything we've heard today essentially describes the same thing. In the middle of the night, people hear loud, insistent knocks on their doors, but the culprit is always nowhere to be found. Days later, the victim is found completely scared out of their wits. What are your thoughts on this, Shayol?" The girl called Shayol looked completely unperturbed as she continued to sip her warm tea, pondering the events of the case. A few days ago, a number of cases in Wanyang County had caught the attention of the king's judiciary. Victims would first faint and fall into a coma. Days later, they became dull and lost their wits. They had neither external nor internal injuries, and even the local physician was at a loss. What linked the cases was a spirit who would knock on the doors of victims before their symptoms started. Rumors about this spirit had already caused widespread panic. How could such evil be allowed to roam free, right under King Qi's nose? The king's judiciary suspected that it was the work of a sorcerer and sent Shayol and Tangji from the Golden Keepers to investigate. "It's not that I'm afraid." Seeing Shayol completely unruffled, Tangji continued, "Everyone has their expertise, and this isn't ours. I think we should just leave this spirit thing to the royal astrologers. They'll figure it out. Shayol frowned at the statement and was just about to respond when the ruckus at the front of the hall caught her attention. A few workers had entered while carrying a body, with a suspect and a few eyewitnesses in tow. The suspect was a young girl with stained red hands, quivering in trepidation. Surprisingly, her face was rather clean. An attractive lady who looked similar to her held the girl tightly in her arms, sobbing uncontrollably. The gazes of the eyewitnesses towards the pair were filled with sympathy. Even before being asked to speak, the eyewitnesses began to chatter away. Apparently, the woman's husband had died a long time ago, and the mother and child were often harassed by the local hoodlum, Jang San. At some point that day, Jang San got into their house and waited until she returned home at noon. The very moment she opened the door, he pushed her to the ground. Physically weaker than the well-built man, she simply could not push him off, and in a moment of desperation, her daughter got hold of a knife and stabbed him. There have been so many rumors about a spirit causing trouble lately. Only Jang San would dare drink into the wee hours every day before heading home. Maybe he was possessed. This morning, he got a basket of eels and said he was going to visit a sorcerer. Seriously? What sorcerer would want to eat something which stinks so much? He seemed all right after the visit, but then got himself so drunk. This sorcerer's some living deity who lives on some mountain in the south? Chongsan must have offended the man. If this is his retribution, it's exactly what he deserves. Shayol heard the whispers going around. Without waiting for a rundown on the condition of the body from one of the workers, she gave Jongsan a quick once-over, and her brows furrowed. She produced a silver needle which was around 4 inches long and inserted it into the body's throat. There aren't any obvious external injuries. He might have been poisoned. Shayol took out a few pieces of paper from her pocket and stuffed them into Jongsan's mouth, perhaps to act as a seal, and said to a worker, "Get me some soapy water." Tang Ji had only just wrapped his head around all that had happened, but immediately felt faint again after hearing what she said. He choked out, "The guy's got a huge hole in his heart and you're saying it isn't obvious? You have a whole crowd of people who saw everything, and they all said it was the work of the little girl. It's obvious from the bloodstains on him that something's off. There's too little blood." Seeing as the needle test would need a bit of time before the results showed, Shayol ripped Jongsan's clothes to reveal the chest wound. She wiped the dirt off with a handkerchief so that Tangji could see the wound. When a person has a knife wound, the skin around the injury should be taut and show some discoloration from the blood trapped under the skin. There should be bruising. However, the skin around the injury isn't tight, there's no bruising, and the bleeding is minimal. There's only one explanation for this. He was already dead before he was stabbed. While she was speaking, the worker who had been instructed to fetch soapy water returned. Shayol removed the silver needle from Jongsan's throat. The tip was jet black and remained so, even after being cleaned with the water. In light of everything she'd seen, she was now absolutely certain. A poisoning? The Liu family exchanged looks, appearing utterly confused. The workers Shayol had brought immediately advanced to shackle the sorcerer, who was seated at the head of the table. However, they were held back by Master Liu. Petrified with fear, he started to yell, "Why are you taking him away when he hasn't even done anything wrong? We were visited by a spirit the day before yesterday, and there have been spirits coming to knock on our door every night since. We need him to keep us alive." Shayol sighed. It was easy to expose lies, but hard to rid the fear of spirits etched in one's mind. Eel blood has a strong smell. If smeared on a door, it can attract bats from miles away and therefore cause a ruckus. Bats are also afraid of light, so they'll fly away immediately if people open the door while carrying lamps. This whole thing about spirits knocking on doors is merely a deceit employed by this sorcerer. There's a type of fish called the blowfish, otherwise known as the pufferfish. It contains an odorless and tasteless poison that is fatal upon contact. Once poisoned, your arms and legs go numb, making it difficult to move. You'll look like you're drunk. Neither eels nor blowfish are products of Centralis. Just like you, though, they're from the south. If your plot using eels hadn't been discovered by Jongsan, who frequently went home late at night, and if you hadn't hastily given him a large amount of pufferfish poison, I may not have been able to connect the dots so quickly. By the looks of it, the people who supposedly are scared stupid from seeing ghosts were merely poisoned. Shayol angled her body towards the crowd and explained, all while keeping her gaze on the visibly uneasy sorcerer, whose forehead was now beaded with sweat. "Poison?" Master Lu's legs went weak and he collapsed into his chair. "Yes, after being refined, this poison becomes less toxic and therefore is no longer lethal. It can be taken with food or liquids daily, and due to its unique nature, cannot be easily detected. Over an extended period, the poison does its damage until the victim becomes permanently disabled. You have no proof. How can you slander someone like this? The sorcerer knew this was the end of him, yet still tried to play it off. This is the wine you drank with Jongsan that day. The sorcerer saw the jade flask Shayol produced and immediately went pale. She continued. There were only 4 hours from the moment Jangsan left your home until his death. If it truly is normal wine, please have a cup in front of everyone and we'll know the truth. White as a sheet, the man glanced at the Liu family, only to be met with hostile gazes trained on him. Thus, he steeled himself, took the flask, and gulped down the liquid. Amid looks of suspicion from the crowd, he wiped his mouth. Just as he was about to run his mouth off to clear his name, he suddenly realized something was off. You switched it? He exclaimed in shock. Of course I did. I switched out the poison for water. There's no way I would poison and kill a criminal right here. Noticing that the sorcerer had crumpled to the ground, she hastily grabbed the bowl on the table, wanting him to spit in it. However, it was too late. In full view of everyone, the sorcerer took his last breath. There was fog as far as the eyes could see, layers upon layers of white ebbing and flowing, as if devouring all in existence. A vague figure could be seen ahead. A tall, fatherly figure. He turned around, and Shayol heard him shouting at the top of his lungs, but she could not make out his words, the heavy fog blurring all her senses. Someone picked her up and ran desperately in the other direction until they slid and fell to the ground. Shayol picked herself up, but the throbbing pain from the fall was the last thing on her mind. She turned around to see that it was Lin, the daughter of the Old Wei mansion's wet nurse and her maidservant, who had carried her away. Shayol wanted to help her up, but the few steps that separated them seemed endless. She walked and walked, but Lin was gradually being swallowed up by the fog. Shayol saw Lin fall to her knees, head hanging down eerily before suddenly, like a puppet whose strings were pulled, she raised a knife and slashed her throat open. Lin's body gradually shriveled up and withered away while ears of rice sprang up around her, growing at a breakneck pace. No, no, no! Shayol sobbed as she ran, but still, she could not approach the sunken figure in the fog. The fog, constantly growing heavier, had already enveloped Shayol fully within its constraints, even seeping into her eyes, nose, and mouth. She struggled, but it was to no avail, and she continued to fall deeper and deeper into the fog. Cough, cough! Shayol's lungs heaved as she awoke from the terrible nightmare, gasping for breath, head buzzing, chest feeling stuffy, and her limbs had gone numb. She took a calming pill from under her pillow and gulped it down before cupping her hands over her nose and mouth to readjust her breathing. A while later, she finally managed to calm down. Her sweat had completely soaked her hair, causing the short hairs framing her face to stick to her skin. She looked as if she had just escaped death. Seemingly sensing its owner's unrest, the little turtle called Satya crawled out of its comfortable little nest and made the arduous journey over to her bed. Her fingers traced the lines of Satya's shell, but her mind was still on that nightmare she had. No matter how much time had passed, Shayol could not bring herself to accept the final ruling of that case. Lin would never have taken her own life. Tang Ji glanced at Shayol, sitting on the other side of the desk. The archive was dimly lit. The flame of a single oil lamp flickered, illuminating their faces. There were dark circles under Shayol's eyes as if she had gone many days without rest, but her gaze was firm as ever. A few days ago, the two of them had rushed to Wanyang County and exposed the culprit behind a poisoning case. Shayol had swapped out the poison with water in an attempt to deceive the suspected sorcerer into confessing, but unexpectedly, the man dropped dead on the spot, seemingly succumbing to his own poison. No other personal effects were found on his body save for some ordinary talismans and a compass. Besides some grains and bits of husk on his teeth, they could find no other clues about the strange poison. Though the suspect's death was odd, the stories of ghostly encounters in the county had quieted down, and thus Shayol Wei and Tang Ji had returned to the Centralis Judiciary to give their report. All was silent until today, when Shayol sought him out in a hurry, claiming to have found more clues from Wanyang County and sharing her intentions to reopen Lin's case. Lin was the maidservant who had accompanied Shayol since her childhood. She died inexplicably in her own home 6 months ago, and her death had been ruled a suicide. Tang Ji knew that Lin held great significance in Shayol's heart, and he was aware of her lingering concern over her case. Still, he found it hard to believe that any connection could exist between these two seemingly unrelated cases, occurring half a year apart. Right now, both of them were in the archive, all records related to Lin's case spread out on the desk before them. All Tang Ji had to do now was trust his partner, who never made any mistakes. Taking a deep breath, he picked up a bamboo scroll. Miss Lin, deceased, formerly a maidservant in Lord Key's estate, hailing from Thunder Cove, Lee County. The informant is... The very first paragraph left Tang Ji wide-eyed. That's right. I was the one who discovered Lin's body. Shayol nodded, expression unchanged. Ms. Lin, age 20, height 5 foot and 3 inches. Found dead in the farmhouse where she lived, mouth and eyes closed, her arms curled up, hands clenched around a sharp tool, appearing to have slashed her own throat. Grains were found in her mouth. The abdomen was slightly swollen and red, likely due to blood pooling from the impact of falling after excessive consumption of alcohol. The fatal injury was a cut to the throat, 2 inches deep at the point of insertion and shallow at the point of exit, appearing to be self-inflicted. Tang Ji stopped. The examination details ended there. That was the 7th day of the 7th lunar month. After the evening bells rang, I went to visit Lin on Jincheng Lane as we had agreed. Yet she did not answer the door for a long time. Shayol shut her eyes and pressed her hands against her forehead, carefully recalling the scene of that day. After breaking through the door, I found Lin knelt on the ground. She had already been dead for a while. Her hair bun was intact and her clothes were neat. Everything in the room was in order. There were no signs of struggle. Several neighbors testified that Lin was alone at home before the incident, and she appeared to be drunk. The investigating official concluded that Lin, intoxicated, was unable to resolve her pent-up emotions and inflicted harm upon herself. That's all the information I have on Lin's case. Shayol ruminated over the autopsy report. Do you still remember Zhangsan's case from Wanyang County? Witnesses claim to have seen Zhangsan drunk during the period after he consumed the poison. You're saying Lin was poisoned with the same thing? Tang Ji was shocked. After returning from Wanyang County, I re-examined this case and came to a different conclusion than what was recorded. Lin was poisoned that day. She was unconscious and unable to resist. Then, the suspect came from behind, holding the knife with Lin's hand and slashing her throat to make it look like a suicide. The official would not have gone through the trouble of using a silver needle to test for poison after seeing the fatal wound on her throat. Ignoring the astonishment on Tang Ji's face, Shayol went on. If the young girl from the Zhangsan case had not stabbed the body, and thus ensured that the case was brought to court, and if we had not connected the symptoms of the previous victims with Zhangsan taking eels to threaten the sorcerer, we never would have suspected a poisoning, and Zhangsan's case would have been treated like Lin's, a drunken accident leading to death and dealt with hastily. Thinking back to the countless cases of accidental deaths around the capital outskirts, if they were all just like Zhangsan's case, Tang Ji felt a shiver run down his spine. Was Lin also murdered by that sorcerer? What about the sorcerer himself? Did he commit suicide for fear of prosecution? Someone else is likely involved. Someone who wanted to silence the sorcerer. Shayol shook her head and opened 2 paper wrappers. One was dated more recently than the other, but they both held the same grain. Does this look familiar to you? This is... The more he looked at them, the more familiar they looked to Tang Ji. Are these the same grains found between the sorcerer's teeth? The new one is from the sorcerer's mouth, and the older one was from Lin's. Neither Lin nor the sorcerer were farmers, so the appearance of these grains is inherently suspicious. Who eats grains without removing the husk first? A small incident is documented in the records left by my father. The owner of a carriage was identified through the type of grain that was transported. We should be able to find that case here too. Shayol stood up and quickly searched through the scrolls on the shelves. Tang Ji dared not interrupt her and stood waiting at the side, dumbfounded at the information. Although rice is consumed in Centralis, it is rarely cultivated here. Rice grains were originally products of Thunder Cove due to their abundant yield, and they were introduced to Centralis for propagation. The cultivar grown in Centralis today has significant differences from Thunder Cove's grains. Shayol pulled out one of the scrolls and spread it open by the oil lamp. The document cited the grain catalog, which carefully distinguished the regional differences between rice cultivars. However, none matched the rice grains before them. The grains found in both cases are long and slender, with a lustrous white appearance. It's very clear that they are not the same variety as the ones from Centralis, but more akin to those in Thunder Cove. However, I have visited rice merchants and old officials overseeing grain production in Centralis since returning from Wanyang County, and none of them recognize this variety. A unique southern variety, a unique southern poison. Tangjer could feel his mind becoming a jumbled mess. I have instructed all our contacts and undercover agents to watch the movements of the people nearby Thunder Cove. Meanwhile, we are also monitoring the import and export of all seafood and crops in Centralis. Our task for tonight is simply to find any suspicious cases from the past few years. Shayol laid down a large stack of scrolls on the desk, placing it between a very reluctant Tangji and herself. This is a concern not just for me nor Wanyang County. If we don't uncover the true culprit behind all this fast, then more and more suicides and accidents may become prevalent in Centralis. Then, what about Lynn's case? I will go to the chief tomorrow and apply for her exhumation and a second autopsy. Finally, at the end of the long and winding corridor was a lit room. Moving shadows were reflected on the paper window. There were people inside. After a careful inspection of her surroundings to make sure that there were no traps, Shayol placed her hand on the hilt of the sword hanging on her back and crouched down, moving quickly but lightly, cautiously approaching the room at the end of the passageway. As she got closer, the smell of burning incense hit her nose, which caused her to frown. It was an indescribable scent, like musty and damp sandalwood being burned. At first, the smell bore a resemblance to the incense commonly used in monasteries, but it invoked an inexplicably chilly and hazy feeling within her. A steady stream of chanting could be heard from within the room, as if someone was reciting some sort of scripture. Shayol had never been one to entertain ideas of higher beings or ghosts, and she knew little of Taoism. It would be difficult for her to discern the content of the scripture. Still, she had a feeling that it did not belong to any of Centralis's customs. Approaching the door, Shayol peered through the gap and was surprised to find a spacious temple inside, furnished no differently than that of any other cultivator's temple. Several believers in loose robes devoutly prostrated themselves under the guidance of a man who seemed to be presiding over the ritual. They reached their arms out as they chanted, seemingly offering their prayers. A towering idol stood at the center that almost reached the ceiling. Its features were obscured by hanging cloth banners, but its body appeared to be that of a regular cultivator. A name that she barely made out as Juanpin was engraved on the base, and suspended between the idol's hands were the very grains that Shayol had been searching for over the past month, the mysterious rice grains that appeared in both bodies of the Sorcerer and Lynn. The follower on the left suddenly stood up and left, returning with a vessel filled with water. The ritual master reached in and pulled out a fish with a large head and a narrow tail. When he took out a knife and stabbed it in the gills, the fish stopped moving. The rest of the men followed suit. Killing in a temple? The pungent smell of fish, blood, and incense mixed together to form an intensely unpleasant smell that nauseated Shayol. The flesh was discarded, but various parts of the fish, such as its eyes, heart, and blood, were stored in different containers before being reverently arranged on the altar. It was only then that Shayol realized that it was no ordinary fish, but a pufferfish that contained highly fatal poison. All of the parts chosen were those where the toxin was most concentrated. When the dragnet was laid over Centralis a month ago, Shayol would never have imagined that the handful of shady sorcerers and pharmacists she would catch would end up being a mysterious cult with a considerable amount of influence. The clues she received converged on this abandoned mansion outside of Jincheng, and with time pressing, Shayol and Tangju decided to split up and act separately. This mission was meant to verify their intel, but now that she had discovered the location of the enemy lair, she had decided to rush back to the Bureau of Justice to report her findings and organize an operation to squash them as soon as possible. Unbeknownst to her, a poisonous snake was approaching her quietly while she was in thought. Shayol shrank back in fear when she noticed it, but the noise drew the attention of everyone in the temple. When she looked closer, that snake had disappeared completely, but before she could process her bewilderment, she witnessed an even more alarming scene. The followers in the temple had all turned around simultaneously when they heard the disturbance. Shayol, who had only seen the figures from the back until now, finally saw the faces of two of the followers, the sorcerer and Zhang San. At the next corner, Shayol stopped abruptly and took off the hang sword on her back. The layout of the passageway that took her less than half an incense stick's time to sneak through earlier had somehow morphed into a labyrinth of winding passageways and identical rooms, trapping Shayol within. The night fog rose and filled the air. Her pursuers closed in from behind, swinging the swords in their hands. Shayol twisted her body to the side and raised the sheathed sword on her back to absorb the attack before turning her hand, skillfully disarming her foe. Holding the hilt of her sword between two fingers, she swung the blade forward, sending a gleaming arc like a crescent moon to her foe and forcing him to roll backward, barely avoiding the attack. Despite the successful counterattack, Shayol had no intention of dispatching him. Instead, she spun the blade around and stabbed behind her. The sound of metal breaking through armor and cutting through skin rang in her ears. The ambusher had no choice but to retreat, clutching his injured side. In the blink of an eye, two formidable cult members had suffered damage from Shayol. They were on their guard now and wary to launch another attack, but they kept Shayol trapped in the narrow passageway between them. With a flick of her wrist, Shayol turned the sword back around, blood splattering onto the wooden floor. She coldly assessed the two cultists bearing the faces of Jung-san and the Sorcerer. There was hesitation in her movements, which was unsurprising as she had been there for the preliminary and secondary examination of their corpses after all. She also witnessed their bodies rotting in the mortuary with her own eyes. However, after the short exchange, she was confident it was a disguise or an illusion. These two cultists were at least living individuals who bled when injured, and as living beings, they could be defeated and apprehended. Despite being dressed like cultivators, their actions followed none of their precepts. They were striking to kill, and Shayol dared not underestimate them. The two cultists learned their lesson after the first attempt. Exchanging glances, they launched a simultaneous attack with their dual blades and staff. Shayol stood firm. A faint green aura enveloped the tip of her sword, pointing straight to the ground. Things happened quickly. When the deadly attack struck, neither Zhang San nor the sorcerer saw what happened. They just felt their weapons hitting their target. The cold glint of a blade flashed before Zhang San's eyes, and a single-edged blade stabbed out from behind his ear, intercepting the horizontal slash of the sorcerer, the only thing preventing his head from rolling at this moment. Meanwhile, his partner, the sorcerer, fell under his own staff. Everything had happened so fast that when Zhang San was been kicked to the ground, dislocated his chin in the impact, and got his limbs tied up, he was still unable to make out what had happened. It was just a split second. When did Shayol get behind him? And when did she swing her sword? After tying up the two of them, Shayol turned around and walked toward the temple without wasting time thinking. By the time Tangji arrived with backup from the bureau, the building would have been emptied. Though she had no idea what the enemy had in store for her, she knew that she could not back down. The further she went, the stronger the smell of incense became, and the thicker the smoke screen grew. The bright light ahead was the temple, its doors wide open. "You're here," a woman's voice came from inside the room. Her voice echoing in the spacious room made it sound almost ethereal. "The seeds that give birth to all have already begun to sprout." Shayol tightened her grip around the hilt of her sword and cautiously approached the temple. A month ago, a sorcerer hurt others to amass wealth in the name of exorcism. "He's a very naughty and dishonest boy." The woman's voice sounded very young, seemingly in her 20s, but her tone was more like a mother speaking of her children. On the 7th day of the 7th lunar month of this year, a woman named Lin died in Jincheng. The cause of death? Suicide. Shayol carefully stepped into the thick fog of the temple while conversing with the voice, attempting to pinpoint her exact location within the smoke. During the autopsy, her flesh was found rotting to the bones, which were dark in color, indicating that she was poisoned before death. I remember Lin. Her smile was beautiful, like a fairy in a painting. That's why I chose her, so that we could become immortals together. Shayol had now reached the core of the thick fog. The woman speaking was right in front of her. Just another step, and she could capture the mastermind. Shayol! The door to the west of the temple was kicked open, and wind poured into the temple. In an instant, the sound of unsheathing swords echoed. The man who kicked down the door rushed inside and shouted anxiously, "Shayol! Are you all right?" As if being woken from a dream, Tangji's voice and the wind dispelled the fog in Shayol's eyes. When she saw what was in front of her, she broke into a cold sweat. Before her was a large incense burner, and she had nearly fallen into it, and the womanly figure she seemed to see was merely a statue next to the burner. The two men tied up by Tangji's feet no longer bore the faces of Jang San and the sorcerer. She looked around, but there was nobody else in the room other than the Golden Keepers. Become the legend you were destined to be. If you enjoyed this video, please help grow the channel by liking and subscribing. See you on the battlefield, brave warrior.